Hey everybody, it's Rick Pidcock, and I hope you are having a good New Year's Eve and day celebration. It can be, I think a lot of us are more than willing to move on from 2025. And I'm here actually, unfortunately, Rathellen has to work, so I am here with my 5 kids and dog. And it's kind of hard for me to find a space of quiet on a day like this, so I am actually um, outside about as far away as I can get for right now. And so hopefully this will work. But there are also neighbors doing yard work, so we'll see. I wanted to take the opportunity to uh, look back a bit at the things that I worked on this last year, specifically with my articles, my podcasts, and my book. And I ended up with 51 articles, 87 podcast episodes, and I completed my first book, which I'll talk a little bit about in a little bit. But basically, at the end of the year, Baptist News Global, who I write for, comes out with their most read opinion analysis and news pieces. And I had 5 articles on those this year that I wanted to kind of go through each one because not just to review where we've been this year, but also I think it really can be informative for where we're going in the future. So I'm going to start by going through the articles, and then we'll transition from there to some information about the podcast and the book. So the in the analysis articles, I ended up with the number 2 most read article, which was titled "John MacArthur Met His Own Definition of a False Prophet." So if you're not familiar, John MacArthur, he's one of the most influential voices in evangelicalism over the last century, and he just died this year. And he on on August 24th or August 29th, 2024, he did a Q&A where he answered the question, "What are the marks of a false teacher?" And he began by quoting the words of Jesus saying, "We will know them by their fruits." And then he said, MacArthur said, quote, "The kind of person a prophet really is cannot help but being revealed." He went on to say, "What is in the heart will emerge, and corrupt theology will result in a corrupt life. False teaching and perverted living are inseparable and eventually will become manifest." And so to start off, like, I completely agree with him on this. MacArthur was very concerned about false teachers. He talked about false teachers all the time. He's trying to define what a false teacher is here, and he's saying that false theology, false teaching theology, will eventually affect the way you live. And I completely agree with him. A corrupt theology will result in a corrupt life. And so as he passed away, there's another passage, I believe, in Matthew 7 where Jesus talks about the way that you're judged, you will be judged. And the way you judge others is how you will be judged. And so basically, when it came to MacArthur's life, I decided to take that approach and say, okay, how MacArthur judged people was whether or not they were false teachers. And he gave these specific ways to identify a false teacher. So let's judge his life based off of that. That seems totally fair to me. But he said, regarding false teachers, he said, "They have a ready hearing among most people because they say only what people like to hear. They want to hear illusions, not truth." And I thought that was rather interesting because he has a lot of followers who like to hear the things that he says. And when you get into the specific things that he says, as I detail in this piece, a lot of it is illusions. It's not truth. He talks about scientific things like the origin of the universe or the global flood, or he talks about, PTSD not being real or human genetics. And a lot of the stuff that he said was it just wasn't real. It wasn't truth. It was illusions. And yet a lot of what he said was about promoting, he saw everything through the lens of authority and submission, and it was about promoting authority and a particular kind of authority, male authority. and conservative Christian straight white male authority. Um, and that's what a lot of people in patriarchal Christianity like to hear. Um, and so he said, regarding a false teacher's converts, he said, quote, "They will attract to themselves people who have the same superficial, self-centered, and unscriptural orientation as they do." And he said, "Their followers will be like them, egotistical, proud, self-centered, self-indulgent, self-willed, and self-satisfied while being religious." And it's like, if you know anything about MacArthur, and if you know anything about his followers, like, that describes these people to a T. They're all about their power. They're all about, MacArthur defined the pastorate as an ascension to power. He said it's the evangelical pastorate is the highest location one can ascend to in the evangelical church. And so I think that just goes to show, by his own definition of a false prophet, he met that definition. A lot of people were upset at me because they're saying, "Oh, you're calling him a false teacher." Well, yeah, I kind of am. But like, you look at his own definition, and I'm just holding him to his own words. So that was MacArthur. And then the number 7 opinion piece was called "Plagiarism is the least thing to worry about with Voddie Baucham, who is a threat to children, women, and daughters." So this was actually a piece that I wrote back in 2022, and it started. It came back again this year after MacArthur, or after Baucham. Sorry, I'm a little distracted here. After Baucham passed away, and I kind of see, like, MacArthur talked a lot about he promoted a lot of this awful theology, and then Baucham kind of put it into practice in the home. So Baucham talked about how babies are vipers in diapers. He said the angry cry happens early, the demanding cry happens early, the stiffening up of the body, that happens early. One of the reasons God makes them so small is so that they won't kill you, and one of the reasons he makes them so cute is so that you won't kill them. And of course, like, the evangelical church that he was preaching to all die laughing. So when I try to critique this stuff, they'll say, "Oh, he was saying a joke. People laughed," and yet he actually believed these things. He wasn't just saying this; he actually does believe these things about babies. That's his theology. And regarding kids, he said, he said they desperately need to be spanked, and they need to be spanked often. There were days when Junior needed to be spanked 5 times before breakfast. You need to have an all-day session where you just wear them out, unquote. Like, even if you believed in spanking, you shouldn't be hitting your kid all day long. Like, this is solving things. This is trying to pursue justice through violence against human bodies. And this is child abuse, period. He went so far as to give the example one time of a pastor's daughter who was very shy, and she went to her dad at church was telling her to shake a male deacon's hand, and she was too nervous to. This is, a little girl, 5, 6-year-old girl, whatever, afraid to shake a grown man's hand. That's totally natural, and she should be, concerned and looking out for herself when it comes to grown men, and her consent should be honored. And yet, Baucham says, he says, quote, "Pastor goes back in the office, goes through that whole process, spank the child, comes back out, child won't do it again, goes back again, asks the deacon, will you please wait here?" 13 times. That deacon was like, "Little girl, please." So here's this girl, she's getting beaten by her dad 13 times, to the point where the deacon is begging this little girl to shake his hand so her dad will stop being violent against her. And Voddie Baucham promotes this stuff. It's child abuse, and it's disgusting. It's gross. And then when the girls grow up, they talk about Baucham talks about how they have to marry a man to serve the man, but until then they have to stay at home, even if they're an adult. They have to stay at home to serve their father. He had an idea called the stay at home daughters, and there was a documentary that came out about it, and the narrator said, quote, "Instead of pursuing an independent career, Jasmine's deliberate new objective is to join her family in helping her fulfill her father's vision." So, like, this is what women are subjected to, and they're totally honest about it. That's what's interesting here is how, like, these men like MacArthur and Baucham, they're not being dishonest. They're quite honest about what they believe, and the dishonesty, I think, is in their followers because they excuse this nonsense. These men promote their brand of Christianity. These men have charisma. And so, because their brand of Christianity is getting promoted, they're unwilling to acknowledge how harmful this teaching is. And I think that all of us, we can't look at the influencers, the popular people who agree with us in our brand of whatever Christianity, atheism, evangelicalism, whatever it might be. We can't look at those influencers and be unwilling to call out the harm that they cause and the harmful ideas that they have because they're promoting our brand. And one thing that I began to notice this year was how that also can happen on the progressive side. And so I wrote this. This article was in the number 8 analysis piece. It was called "Allegations Against Tim Whitaker and the New Evangelicals Show How Hierarchy Transfers to Progressive Ministries." So obviously, like with MacArthur and Baucham's ideas, it obviously needs to be deconstructed. We need to analyze their theology and their fruit, and we need to show how harmful it is. And one of the people who's been doing this over the last few years, last half a decade or so, is a guy named Tim Whitaker, and he started an organization called the New Evangelicals. They grew to eventually having about 323,000 followers on social media, and then there was an incident where Tim Whitaker was accused by a woman who was working for them of rage driving. He was angry at her. It was driving in the car very erratically, made her feel very unsafe, and it ended up to the point where there was a grace investigation, godly response to abuse in the Christian environment, and Grace did a report, and basically Tim Whitaker and the New Evangelicals claimed that they agreed with the findings in the Grace report and that they promised they would follow the recommendations. And so for me, I initially wrote this story basically saying, because a lot of conservatives are going to respond to this and say, see, progressives have the same problem, so their critiques of hierarchy are wrong. They're going too far in their critique of hierarchy. And my point in the article was, no, like, progressive people aren't going far enough because we're not recognizing the power dynamics that are still embedded within us. Because we still have, even if we're not in a local church per se, we still have the white male pastor, the deacon board that supposedly keeps them accountable, or elder board or whatever. And then the supporters, the givers, the tithers. And we don't recognize how we're creating these same power dynamics that hurt the women that are connected to us. And so there was basically, since then, lawyers, T&E has gotten lawyers involved behind the scenes, making demands of the reporting victim. They've, to the point where the victim had to get a lawyer, and then the T&E lawyer was ghosting the reporting victim's lawyer. So while, like, all the stuff publicly is, oh, we're following the Grace report and all that stuff, like, no, behind the scenes, you're not. And another odd detail was that Grace said that during this process, the New Evangelicals hired a mediator who had multiple conflicts of interest. And that mediator's name was Laura Anderson, who is a very popular ex-evangelical. She's very popular in ex-evangelical podcasts. She wrote a book about spiritual abuse. She has a therapy and coaching practice. She still has a podcast. And I thought that was odd. And so I looked into it, and basically, like, come to find out, I ended up talking with 7 women who had experienced some level of abuse from Laura Anderson. And so I wrote another article. This was the number 12 article called Licensing Agency Finds Religious Trauma Coach in Violation of Code of Ethics. And ironically, she had the same rage-driving accusations that Tim Whitaker had while she was providing this mediatorship for Tim Whitaker. She was also found guilty of multiple AAMFT ethics violations, with another case pending. The results still have not been released yet on that second case, which may signify that it's an appeals process. I don't know. I'm trying to find that out. But she was also treating employees as friends and clients. For example, she said in writing to one, she said, quote, "I believe you have a dissociative identity disorder, not otherwise specified, that is brought on from trauma, a survival strategy." And this person did not consent to her giving them that. And this person would take that as a diagnosis. I believe that you have a dissociative identity disorder. Like, how are you not going to take that as a diagnosis? And if you haven't consented to that, that's unethical. She in her book, the first chapter of her book, she admitted to becoming romantically involved with a minor in their youth group, but then she blamed the youth pastors for abuse due to the youth pastor's decision not to allow her around the minor anymore. Like, Anderson has no business at all being trusted by survivors of spiritual abuse. But people think she's cool to promote their brand, and so they continue associating with her. They continue platforming her in progressive spaces, despite knowing these accusations against her. It's sickening. It's disgusting. And I don't trust anybody who continues, knowing the information, to act like nothing happened, because you're not believing 7 women. All of these women cannot be coming up randomly with the similar dynamics and the similar story if there was nothing to any of it, especially when the AAMFT has found her guilty of 2 violations and brought at least one other case to her, against her. So at this point, if you know this information and you're continuing to associate with her, you are complicit in violence against women. That is simply the truth, whether you like that or not. Speaking of being complicit in violence and projecting onto others what you yourself are guilty of, that brings me to my final article to discuss, and that was the number 1 most read opinion piece for Baptist News Global this year, titled "Dear White Evangelicals, I Was Wrong." Those of us who grew up in white evangelicalism, we were always told, like, the government would be used against Christians. The government would arrest Christians during prayer. The government would police our language, specifically about sexuality. The government would try to start a government religion. And yet we didn't believe them. We laughed. We thought it was over the top. It was conspiracy thinking. Who would come up with these ideas? The Democrats didn't seem to care about starting a religion, a government religion. And yet in the end, these conservative evangelicals turned out to be right, because the government is now doing these things. It's just not as we thought, because it's the conservatives in the government who is wielding the government against Christians, arresting them during prayer, policing the language about sexuality, starting government religion, and so basically the article was, an apology saying, I was wrong, you were right, please forgive me. So basically, like, I look back on all these stories, and I summed it up in a piece, my final piece of the year, which was called "When What's Good for Christianity Isn't Good for Your Neighbor." And I talked about Charlie Kirk, and there was a video that came out of Charlie Kirk talking to a Palestinian Christian, and in the in the video, Kirk asks the guy, he says, "As a Christian, do you think that it's better for Christianity to have Israel controlled by Jews or Israel controlled by Muslims? What's better for Christianity?" And I basically just summed up the year by saying, like, this gets to the heart of the problem we're seeing, because people are asking what's better for their brand of Christianity. And they're not asking what's better for their neighbors, what's good for their neighbors. And they're allowing all kinds of harm to go unchecked because they care about more about protecting and advancing a brand than about loving their neighbors. And so in 2026, I would love for us, if we want to be a healing presence in the world, to stop sacrificing our neighbors on the altar of our brands. We need to start actually listening to women, not just listening to women who criticize conservative people, but listening to women who report harm wherever it happens. And that's one of the things I focused on in my writing this year. Also, the podcast, Highest Power Church and State, it just started this year. There was a lot of overlap in some of the episodes. We talked a lot about John MacArthur, Doug Wilson. We talked about Tim Whitaker and Laura Anderson. I sent out a Substack. You can follow me on Substack at Exiles in Christendom. And I sent out a Substack with the top podcasts of the year as well. And you can go back and listen to those. And then also, finally, my book, Weapons of Worship, How the Songs of Evangelicalism Form the Soundtrack of Extremism. It's coming out September 26th, and you're probably going to be seeing a lot of this this year, not just like from me promoting my book, but like Sean Foyt, who's one of these Christian nationalist worship leaders, he's actually meeting with the government to put on government-sponsored revival and worship services to coincide with the United States' 250th anniversary. And so there's going to be all kinds of events popping up this year from that. And so this book is going to kind of explain the history of what has led to this. It's going to explain the dynamics that are at play, not only in some of these more politically explicit gatherings, but in just regular Sunday morning worship at white evangelical megachurches. So right now in the publishing process, we're wrapping up the editing. We're getting endorsements. I'll be recording the audiobook here in a couple months and redoing my website. Because I need to get a new website, because when I first started my website, it was before I really started writing professionally, so I wasn't really sure where my writing was going to go. And so there's a bit of a disconnect with where my website is currently designed and where it ended up going. So I'm going to be redoing the website. But the book will come out September 26th, 2026, and you'll be hearing more about that soon. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this video because my dog is barking and may need a little bit of one-on-one time. So anyway, that's a bit of a wrap-up of what I looked at this last year, and a kind of a preview for how I think we can hopefully begin a healing process in 2026. So I appreciate everybody's support more than you know. Thank you so much for those who subscribe to the different places where I've got, social media accounts and stuff. I'm primarily involved at Facebook and Substack, and so if you want to follow me there, that would be cool. You can usually find me at Rick Pidcock. It's pretty easy. There aren't too many of us out there. So anyway, I appreciate everybody's support and hope everybody has a great new year, and hopefully we'll start getting on a better track in 2026 than we did in 2025.